It's a story of sexual misconduct in the workplace, but this time, the workplace is the police station, and the person in power is a woman. I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers, and I'm delighted to welcome New York Times bestselling author Scott Turow. 40-plus years ago, his novel Presumed Innocent was not only a blockbuster, but this book was a trailblazer for the popularity of legal thrillers that followed. He sold more than 30 million copies, and his books have been translated into 40 different languages. Today, he joins me with a new book, and it is called Suspect. Scott, I get so excited when I see you have a new book because you don't churn them out every year, but I am betting that your publisher would love it if you did.
They would certainly be happy if I wrote faster. And all I can say is I retired as a practicing lawyer 2 years ago, and I've definitely picked up the pace. But I don't think I'm ever going to equal my friends who manage to make it 2 books a year.
Okay, we have to talk about Suspect. First of all, thank you, because now I have a new favorite private investigator. Her name is Pinky. We met her briefly in a previous book, but now she is the star, and she is complicated. So can you describe Pinky?
Pinky, who is the granddaughter of my recurring character, Sandy Stern, is somebody who has never been comfortable in her own skin. She sees herself as an oddball and kind of marks that to the world by wearing what looks like a common nail through her nose. She's inked from neck to ankle, and she's right about herself. She's maybe even somewhere on the spectrum, in the sense that she can't interpret social cues the way everybody else does. But on the other hand, because she's such an outsider, she's discovered that she's pretty adept as an investigator, both because people are unsuspecting of her and because she sees things from greater distance than most of us do.
As I'm reading the book, what jumps out at me is that she was a delight to write. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. I had a lot of fun writing this book. There is no question about it. I have to admit, though, that I had my heart in my mouth much of the way, because it's admittedly, especially today, a daring thing for a 73-year-old straight guy to write about a 33-year-old bi female. And I knew I was responsible for, if not getting it completely right, certainly making it right enough that the illusion would hold.
So what was the bigger challenge? Was it that Pinky is female, or that Pinky was really young?
You know, I mean, I probably am dating myself just by saying this, but I've never really thought of gender as being an insuperable barrier between people, and that would include as an author. So I mean, like everybody else, I've been around women my whole life, and I think I've absorbed enough of their perspective to be able to imagine the world from their eyes. The 2-generation difference, however, between Pinky and me is much more complicated. And, you know, I think it's a truism that our perspective on the world seems to change with each generation. And it's very hard to completely see the world as somebody 40 years younger than me does. And that was the real challenge.
You know, you spoke about perspective. You write this book from Pinky's perspective, from her point of view. And this is more really of a crafting question. Did you always know that it would be her voice?
No. I got the idea to write about Pinky after my last novel, The Last Trial, where Pinky was um, widely welcomed by readers. And I thought, wow, that might be interesting to try to write a book from her point of view. I thought she was quirky enough to certainly be able to carry it. But I never entertained the idea of writing in the first person. And every novelist who's going to be at the Miami Book Fair, and every novelist you meet will tell you that your imagination does not always conform to what you expect of it. And so as I began making notes for the novel, I found that I was writing in the first person, and I thought, well, that's amusing enough. But of course, when I sit down to actually write a draft of the book, I'll shift to third person and have some distance on Pinky. And lo and behold, when I started my draft of the first chapter, it was still in the first person. So I rewrote it in the third person and then sent both versions to my editor. And I said, she's being really cranky. She insists on speaking for herself. And, is this too much for your taste? And he wrote back, Ben Severe, my editor, and said, well, I got to agree with you. I think it's working better in the first person, so let's try it. And if it, over the long haul, it seems inauthentic or too risky, then, you can rewrite in the third person. I add that's always easier for the editor to say than the author to do, but I thought it was adequate guidance. But I will say that was the last discussion we had about the voice in the book. And, I sent it in, the whole draft in first person, and we never talked about it again.
Because it was genius. Women shine in this book, not just Pinky. There's Tanya, who is a cop. There's Lucy, the police chief. I don't do any spoilers here, but you do this right in the beginning of the book. There are accusations of sexual misconduct against the police chief. And then there's this reveal. At the end of the first chapter, the chief is a woman. So I was just curious, because she is a woman, legally and morally, is this as clear-cut as if it would be if the police chief was that traditional man?
Yeah, I think what interested me about it is that as far as the law is concerned, there's no distinction based on gender. But given what we know in the culture and just the inherent differences in between the genders, even if we're just talking about physical size, like Pinky says at the beginning to Rick, her boss, you explained to me how she forced these guys to have sex. They're all 6 inches and 50 pounds bigger than she is, and each one of them was carrying a service revolver. So how did she force them? And the nuances of these situations really do change with the gender roles reversed from what we typically imagine. And that is not to say that it changes the ultimate issues of right and wrong, but it does, I think, deepen our understanding as we go along.
As complicated as I felt Pinky was as a character, Lucy, who is also interesting, was extremely difficult. I mean, here is this high stakes case. She makes it so not easy for the attorney. If she were your client, would you be pulling your hair out with this person? I mean, she was difficult.
She's difficult. It probably doesn't give anything away to the people who are familiar with my books to say that she's not fully candid with her lawyer or his investigator. And yet at the same time, you have to understand what a really complex world she exists in. She's a first generation American who's risen to a position of power in this community, and is now the top person in this police force. She's had to do that in what is still a very male world. And, police departments are better, but it's still 30 years ago in most police departments I'm familiar with. And so she's done this by a combination of camaraderie at times. She's never anybody but Lucy when she's outside the station. And but still asserting authority because she's got to be the chief. And she can't let the desire to be accepted overcome the judgment that she's supposed to impose in behalf of the community. So she's always walked a tightrope. And, we understand as the story goes along the kinds of compromises that she's felt that she's had to make, right or wrong.
Put your attorney hat on for a moment. Did you write this from maybe having had clients that were not forthcoming with the truth?
Every person who's practiced in the criminal arena, whether frankly as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer, has dealt with the witness and the client who's not fully forthcoming. And, it's part of the nature of the game. So I knew a lot about the police departments from a lawyer's perspective. I prosecuted cops for civil rights violations. I defended cops. I was a member of the State Police Merit Board, which hired and disciplined state troopers. I was a prosecutor in private practice in police disciplinary cases. I've represented police officers. I even represented the Labor Council for the Fraternal Order of Police, which is basically the police unions. So this was a terrain that I was very familiar with as a lawyer. I don't claim that I've had any experience as a police officer because Lord knows I haven't, but I know how it looks from the lawyer's eye.
In another part of the book, in addition to being the author that can occasionally murder people, you created this criminal enterprise, this diabolical criminal enterprise. So, one, how did you come up with this clever plot? And we'll say as much or as little as you would like. Where did the scheme come from?
This is not directly from my experiences as a lawyer, but it definitely arises from those experiences. And it's a sort of embroidery on some of the things that I saw in practice. And it's unfortunately not unfamiliar for police officers to steal narcotics from criminal defendants and sell them. That is, the officers sell the drugs themselves, because the defendant's hamstrung. The defendant cannot say, "Oh, they've charged me with having 6 ounces of heroin, but I really had a pound," because, there'll be escalating penalties based on the quantity of the drugs. And, the world of drug policing is very morally compromised, very difficult. The undercover work that many officers do, in which they pretend to be drug dealers, is corrosive sometimes. And so, that's where the genesis of a much more complicated plot arose from.
All right, we talked around that nicely. I have to ask about this one character who may be, he's so evil. He is so evil. He is Ritz. And there are not enough adjectives to describe him. Give us a glimpse into that character.
Well, in my novels, generally speaking, the bad guy is complicated. And he's a bad guy, but, a case can be made for him if you see things the way that he or even she does. Ritz, and it's not giving away a lot, Ritz is unabashedly evil. He is bad to the bone. He has occasionally redeeming characteristics in the way he treats his ex-wife, for example, and her family. But he is somebody who enjoys being a crook because he thinks he's got a kind of Nietzschean view of this, and he thinks it proves that he is a member of a slightly superior race. And that is what he is always trying to do, to prove that he's got reason to look down on the rest of us. So, and he makes really no bones about it. He knows exactly who he is.
Scott, I have talked to so many authors who started their career in law, and then the writing evolved. Your route was a little different. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, my mom wanted to be a novelist, and she never had the time and to some extent the discipline to pursue that. So along the way, I guess I kind of absorbed her ambition. By the time I was 11 years old, I had announced that I wanted to be a novelist. That was based on the excitement I felt reading The Count of Monte Cristo, thinking if it was that thrilling to read the book, imagine how much more exciting it must have been to write it. And, and that's the way an 11-year-old would think about the world. So but I pursued that ambition diligently. I ended up as a writing fellow at Stanford after college. Then I started teaching there. And it was great to be surrounded by the many, many talented young writers who were at the Stanford Writing Center when I was there. People like Raymond Carver or Alice Hoffman or Richard Price and many other people whose names you haven't heard because, they were blown off course by bad luck or bad decisions in their lives. But it was a hard time for me for all kinds of reasons, one of which being that I suffered from what I call the writer's disease, and I really couldn't turn my imagination off. And I was consumed in a way that made, ordinary living difficult. And so I decided rather than continue and pursue an academic career, which just didn't have the same kind of hold on me, that I was going to go to law school because I had sort of discovered the law backhandedly, and it fascinated me. And it seemed important to me to be doing something that I thought would have an emotional grip on me, sufficient to really get me out of my own head. And so I went off to law school thinking, of course, that I would both practice law and write. And all of my friends who were attorneys told me that I was fooling myself. And, of course, I came to understand what they were talking about, and I managed to do it anyway.
That you did. Your law background feeds into your fiction. You have lived the courtroom scenes and the clients. But the fiction that you write is rooted in the law. And way back, you wrote a book. It was called Ultimate Punishment, and it dealt with the death penalty. And you also were on the Capital Punishment Commission. I would like you to reflect on that if you could, please.
Sure. I learned a lot about the death penalty system, at least as it existed in the state of Illinois. And, I wrote a novel about it called Reversible Errors, but that didn't really get to everything about my experience. And particularly in the course of sitting on the Capital Punishment Commission in Illinois, which was charged with delineating what reforms, if any, would make the application of capital punishment in Illinois fair, just, and equitable. I really reflected a whole lot on my own attitudes toward it. And Ultimate Punishment, the book that you mentioned, Anne, was just kind of a very honest, not particularly preachy perspective on what it was like to be, a practitioner in this system. And I always say I don't criticize anybody's attitudes toward the death penalty because I've held them all. I've been for it. I've had grave doubt, and I arrived at a position where I am now of being against it. And I'm against it for one fundamental reason, which is I don't think that the death penalty gives us what people expect from it, which is a kind of moral call that for ultimate evil, there's an ultimate punishment. And that's just not the way the system works. It does not, it's far from foolproof in more ways than we can detail in the course of a brief television program.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate how you answered that. This book is a little bit different for you, in my opinion, because most of your books that I've read have lots of courtroom scenes. And this one, it is law enforcement, not the lawyers, who happen to get things resolved here. So, I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it was a little bit of a twist for me.
Yeah, one of your colleagues in the UK pointed out to me something that I never thought of on my own, which was this is the first book, first novel I've written, which is told entirely from the point of view of somebody who is not a lawyer. And she is an investigator. She's a former would-be cop. And she's, in some ways, in terms of her spirit, she's much more allied with the law enforcement system than she is with the legal system. And so the very astute observation you just made, that it's really the sort of investigative and law enforcement side of things that it becomes the true truth-finding mechanism in this. Whereas, in my books, it's very often what happens in the courtroom where the truth is detected. Here, it's what Pinky does on the street that ultimately, solves the various questions about who did what.
Good. I feel validated now. That's the way I saw it as well. We have talked about the book Suspect. We have talked around the plot, so we didn't give anything away. And in the few minutes we have left, I want to learn a little more about you. And first, tell me about the Rock Bottom Remainders. And for people that don't know who that is and what that is, let us know. And are we ever going to hear it again?
The Rock Bottom Remainders is a band of best-selling authors, which was first assembled by Kathy Goldmark, the late, wonderful Kathy Goldmark, who was what gets colloquially referred to as an author schlepper, meaning somebody who escorts authors when they got, in Kathy's case, to San Francisco and had to run between radio and TV stations and press interviews and book signings. Kathy was a terrific musician herself and eventually realized that a number of the authors that she had met along the way were interested in music, were good performers themselves. And so she became the inspiration for the Rock Bottom Remainders. And that included people like Dave Barry, and originally Barbara Kingsolver, Amy Tan, who has just recently given up the ghost on the band, Stephen King, at the beginning, Matt Groening, and some of the members of the band, like Mitch Albom, who joined pretty close to the inception, are very fine musicians. And then there are people like me, literal, real, no talent bums who are up there performing with the Remainders just to prove that the rest of them can't take themselves seriously if they're letting this guy on stage with them. And but that means that I, in many ways, have had more fun than anybody else, because in no imaginable universe should I be on stage performing beside the likes of Roger McGuinn, or the late Warren Zevon, or Judy Collins, or the late Leslie Gore. And yet I have been, and it's just been the hugest fun in the world. And the band, in years past, had performed annually at the Miami Book Fair. We did perform this year at the Nantucket Literary Festival. We had a great time. We've all reached a point in life where every time the band performs, there's a suspicion that it's the last time. But there's, like all great rock bands, we seem to resurrect ourselves every now and then. And, I'll be ready to do what little I do whenever they call again.
And I, for one, am very glad that I got to see them. So thank you for that. Scott Turow, thank you so much for being here and for spending this time with us.
It's a joy, Ann. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Ann Bocock, and I hope you can join us on the next Between the Covers.